On the night of July 14th, 1881, the infamous outlaw Billy the Kid was killed in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Sheriff Pat Garret was questioning Pete Maxwell as to Billy's whereabouts when the kid walked into the darkened room. Realizing he wasn't alone, Billy spoke his final words. "Quien es? Who is it?" Garret, upon recognizing the kid's voice, drew his revolver and shot twice, the first bullet striking Billy in the chest just above the heart, thus ending the short yet bloody career of Billy the Kid. But did things really go down like that? Did Pat Garret really kill Billy the Kid? Well, in 1950, 69 years after Billy was supposedly killed, a man known as Brushy Bill Roberts met with the governor of New Mexico, claiming to be Billy the Kid and requesting the pardon that he was promised decades before. The 90-year-old Roberts spoke fluent Spanish, and like the kid, he too was ambidextrous. He had 4 signed affidavits from people who actually knew Billy the Kid back in the day, swearing that he was indeed Billy. And he had every bullet wound Billy was said to have, and then some. Was Brushy Bill really Billy the Kid? And if not, who the hell was he? Find out all of this and more on this Emilio Estevez, Lou Diamond Phillips, and Kiefer Sutherland edition of Bloody Beaver Podcast. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with Billy the Kid and the Young Guns movies. And when I say obsessed, I'm not using the word lightly. We actually played Young Guns at recess in the 4th grade. I never got to be Billy, though, because that asshole kid Zach insisted on playing him, so I was stuck with Doc, which is fine, I guess, but I really wanted to be Billy. But yeah, I had both movies on VHS, and not even the legitimate VHS, but recorded to VHS from TV, so commercials and all. I even had the Young Guns 2 Bon Jovi album soundtrack. You know the one. So yeah, I was obsessed. And not only that, a spark was lit in my imagination. Those of you who've actually seen Young Guns 2 knows how it starts off. A grizzled old man in dusty clothes sits on the edge of a road, horse grazing nearby. A big rig whizzes past as he waits. Finally, a car pulls up and a city slicker gets out. Mr. Roberts? William Roberts? And then old man Emilio Estevez drops a bombshell. "I'm Billy the Kid, and I want that fucking pardon." Yes! The entire movie is narrated by old man Billy. And at the end, the lawyer asks if he has scars. It's just some way to prove your claims. "You ask about scars. I've got scars." And Billy walks away into the sunset. Oh yeah, it was so cool when I was a kid, and I was convinced. For years, anytime the subject of Billy the Kid came up, I told people he didn't die young, but actually lived to be an old man. Know this. This is not really an unbiased look into the facts behind Brushy Bill Roberts. I'm kind of biased. I want him to be Billy the Kid. The idea of the most legendary outlaw of all time faking his death and living to be an old man fascinates the hell out of me. But I also like things such as facts, logic, and basic reasoning. And I do try to make an active effort to not give in to confirmation bias. Another movie I loved as a kid was Harry and the Hendersons. I wanted Bigfoot to be real so bad, and I wanted him to be my best friend. Now that I'm an adult, kind of, I realize Bigfoot is definitely not real. What's more, I question the credibility of anybody who claims to have had a run-in with Bigfoot. So all that said, let's get into it. Wait, before we do, there's another few things I need to say. There's going to be a lot of names and aliases used during this episode, a lot of dates as well. It's going to get frustrating and tedious at points. So hopefully it doesn't get too confusing or boring. I did try to keep it as simple as I could. This podcast is also not going to be about the historical Billy the Kid. One of the things I decided when the idea of creating a podcast based on Old West characters occurred to me was, I'm not just going to go into the topics that everybody already knows about. I didn't want to be a basic bitch. I'm never going to do a podcast episode on the fight at the OK Corral, for example. It's been done. We've all seen Tombstone. If I do discuss a very famous Western character like I'm doing now with Billy the Kid, it's going to be something obscure or lesser known. Like Brushy Bill Roberts. Or like, speaking of the OK Corral, did you know that Wyatt Earp lived to be an old man and was actually an advisor for the early Western movies? Yep. Did a young John Wayne serve him coffee and then base all of his future characters off Wyatt Earp's mannerisms? Nope, that's probably just an urban legend. Was there a Texas Ranger named Three-Legged Willie who traveled the frontier with a peg leg? You're damn right there was. Guys like him are who I want to talk about. So all of that said, we already know who Billy the Kid was. So we're not going to go in depth into his short career as an outlaw. But for those of you that are new to his story, I'll do a really quick rundown. The conventional story goes that Billy was born in the Irish slums of New York City in 1858. His mother, Catherine, contracted tuberculosis, and it was recommended that she live in a drier climate. They moved to New Mexico, where she eventually died. Young Billy, orphan, took odd jobs to feed himself, and he had his first run-in with the law at the age of 14. He eventually started work at a ranch where he had a violent confrontation with a bully. While pinned down and being beaten, Billy pulled out a pistol and killed the man that was beating on him. He soon found work for another rancher named John Tunstall, who took him in and was sort of a mentor for young Billy. He and other ranch employees worked for Mr. Tunstall as regulators. They regulated any stealing of his property, and they were damn good at it too. Mr. Tunstall had a soft spot for runaways, derelicts, vagrant types. But you can't just be any geek off the street. Gotta be handy with a steel, if you know what I mean. Earn your keep. No, not exactly. If you've ever seen Young Guns, then you'll get that quote. You'll also get it if you're a fan of early 1990s hip-hop, specifically the sweet melodies of Warren G. Anyway, so Billy did really work for Mr. Tunstall, and the other men working for Tunstall were just as loyal to him as Billy was. There was trouble brewing in Lincoln County at this time between Tunstall and the powerful Dolan Murphy faction. Things came to a head when Tunstall was murdered in 1878. This kicked off what was known as the Lincoln County War. Billy and other former Tunstall employees formed the Regulators. They wanted revenge, and to some extent, they got it. The conflict was rife with revenge killings, including, amongst others, the death of Sheriff John Brady. Further killings continued unabated, finally culminating in the Battle of Lincoln when Lawyer McSween's house was surrounded by the military, set afire, and Billy and friends made a getaway through a hell of gunfire. At least 22 men were killed during the Lincoln County War, and afterwards, the survivors just kind of drifted. Billy was a wanted man with $500 on his head, and he continued the outlaw life, living on the fringe and rustling cattle for the next 3 years. Pat Garret was chosen as sheriff, and his chief job was to track down and bring Billy to justice, which he did. Only Billy was highly skilled in the art of escaping from jail, once even killing 2 deputies while doing so. Then finally, on that fateful night of 1881, Garret killed Billy, and the rest is history. Maybe. As I grew older, and what I like to think more logical, I came to the conclusion that probably Brushy Bill was full of shit, and Billy really did die at the tender age of 21. There's not a single legitimate historian that buys into the Brushy Bill story, and it's been debunked a million times. So I thought. But I never really took a deep dive into it until I started doing research for this episode. I thought it would be an open and closed, just slam dunk case, and boy was I wrong. So Brushy Bill, who was he? Before we get into that, it's important to say that Billy's early life, before arriving in Lincoln County, New Mexico, is highly contested as well. We don't even know for certain what his actual name was. He had so many aliases. William Antrim, also known as Henry Antrim, also known as Kid Antrim, also known as Henry McCarty, also known as Billy Bonney, also known as Billy Eilish, also known as Billy Bats, also known as Billy Goat Gruff. And yes, I did just make those last 3 up. The general consensus, though, is that his real name was probably William Henry McCarty. His mom married a man by the last name of Antrim, so he went by his stepdad's last name at times. Bonnie is thought to be his mother's maiden name. And then there's the issue of where he was born. Historians agree that it was probably New York City, but it hasn't been proven. As a matter of fact, an organization called the Billy the Kid Outlaw Gang is offering up $500 to the first person who finds irrefutable proof of Henry McCarty's birth, his father's name, and where he was born. So far, nobody has yet claimed the reward. And then there's Brushy Bill Roberts, the man who claimed to be Billy the Kid. Like I already mentioned, he said his real name was William Henry Roberts and that he was born in Buffalo Gap, Texas in 1859. After not being killed by Garret, Roberts claimed to have left New Mexico in 1881. Roberts, aka Brushy, worked mostly with livestock. He became a cowhand, earned an impressive reputation as a breaker of horses, and embarked on various adventures, always using an alias. He married 3 times over the span of his life, and then finally, in his 80s, moved to Hamilton County, Texas with his wife. In July of 1948, a man by the name of William V. Morrison knocked on Brushy Bill's door. Morrison worked for a law firm that had recently settled an inheritance case for a Mr. Joe Hines. Hines, a Florida resident, was trying to claim property of his newly deceased brother. The only problem was his name wasn't really Joe Hines. And obviously using an alias caused several problems when trying to claim an inheritance. Joe Hines was actually Jesse Evans, a former gunfighter and outlaw who had participated in the aforementioned Lincoln County War. Through the course of settling the case, Jesse let it slide that Billy the Kid was not actually dead, but alive and well and residing in Hamilton, Texas. Morrison was able to determine the alias Billy was living under, Ollie L. Roberts, the Ollie being short for Oliver, aka Brushy Bill. Told you there were going to be lots of names and aliases. And then he paid him a visit. Initially, Roberts denied being Billy the Kid, instead saying that the kid was actually his cousin and living in Mexico. It wasn't until Roberts' wife wasn't around that he finally admitted that he was indeed the infamous kid. He had been hiding and living in fear for 70 years, and much like Emilio Estevez, he wanted that damn pardon, the one that had been promised to him by Governor Lew Wallace. And I forgot to mention what all this pardon talk is about. Billy the Kid was arrested and sentenced to death by hanging for participation in the killing of Sheriff Brady, which he did take part in. The governor of New Mexico at the time, Lew Wallace, offered the kid a pardon in 1879 if he testified before a grand jury about another killing that the kid had witnessed. Billy testified, but the Governor Wallace never followed through. Fun fact, Governor Wallace was the author of Ben-Hur. Okay, so now what? Like I said before, there were people who met with Roberts and Morrison, people who knew Billy the Kid prior to his reported death, who signed affidavits swearing that Roberts was indeed Billy. Roberts showed all of his bullet wounds to Morrison. He also had inside knowledge that wasn't known to the general public about the Lincoln County War, including the layouts of the McSween place and the Maxwell house. He knew names and dates. He spoke Spanish. One of the reasons Billy was so able to easily escape from jail was that he had small hands. His hands were actually smaller than his wrists, allowing him to easily shimmy out of handcuffs. According to Morrison, Roberts also had small hands. Eventually, Morrison was able to make an appointment with the governor of New Mexico, Thomas Mabry, to get that pardon for Brushy that he was promised way back in 1879. And it turned into a shit show. What was supposed to be a private meeting turned out to be open to the press. And not only that, but the sons of Pat Garrett were in attendance, as well as the grandson of Sheriff Brady, who Billy was accused of killing. There were historians present, as well as photographers and journalists. It was basically like that movie Dinner for Schmucks, only instead of Steve Carell, they were all laughing at Brushy Bill. A noticeably shaken and frightened Roberts became confused and stumbled through the questioning, at one point even having to lie down. He was given a memory test, which he failed horribly. He got several basic facts about Billy the Kid's life wrong. Ultimately, he was denied the pardon. Governor Mabry was quoted as saying that he would take no action now or ever on the petition for a pardon. Less than a month later, on December 29th, 1950, Brushy Bill Roberts fell dead of a heart attack in his hometown of Hyco, Texas. And people have been arguing about his true identity ever since. Reputable historians, like I said before, denied that Brushy Bill was who he said he was. As a matter of fact, as recently as 2015, an ASU professor is petitioning the state of New Mexico to issue a death warrant for Billy the Kid, thus legally proving that he died in 1881 at the hands of Pat Garrett. But not everyone is so convinced, and they may possibly have a good reason for feeling that way. After Brushy's death, the paralegal Morrison wrote a book titled Alias Billy the Kid, in which he shares Brushy's story and lays out the evidence that he claims proved that Brushy was indeed Billy. And people ate it up. Even former President Harry Truman was convinced Brushy was Billy the Kid. He lamented in a letter written to Morrison that Roberts died before receiving his pardon. A chronic masturbator and former host of The O'Reilly Factor, Bill O'Reilly, stated in one of his books that the amount of evidence supporting Brushy Bill's claims outweighed the amount that didn't. What say you, Bill?
I can't do it.
Okay.
We'll do it live. Okay.
I don't know about that.
No, we'll do it live. Fuck it.
I gotta edit it, dude.
Do it live.
Nope.
I'll write it and we'll do it live.
I already wrote it.
Fucking thing sucks.
Okay, that's enough out of you. Anyway, Brushy Bill. While doing research, and I very, very loosely use the term research, for this podcast episode, I got my hands on a book titled Billy the Kid Beyond the Grave, written by W.C. Jameson. It's well written and very much pro Brushy Bill. In the book, Jameson lays out several arguments as to why Billy the Kid was not killed in 1881 and what he considers proof that Brushy Bill Roberts, a.k.a. Ollie P. Roberts, a.k.a. Ollie L. Roberts, a.k.a. William Henry Roberts, was actually Billy the Kid. Fucking aliases. So what's the problem? Why can't anybody agree? First, it's a matter of credibility. And I'm not talking about the credibility of Brushy Bill Roberts yet. I'm talking about that of Pat Garrett, the man who is said to have killed Billy the Kid. Pat wasn't exactly the epitome of honesty and integrity. He published his own book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, a year after Billy's death, and it was just full of inaccuracies and out-and-out lies. And a lot of what we think we know about Billy comes from this book. For instance, Billy's birthday, as stated in the book, just happens to be the birth date of the book's ghost author, Ash Upson. And Billy didn't, as legend goes, kill 21 men, one for every year of his life. It was a lot closer to about 9. And with some of those, he definitely was not the only one shooting, such as the killing of Sheriff Brady. It's impossible to know if Billy's bullets were the ones that did the killing or those of his companions. And was Billy even 21 when he was killed? There's arguments about that as well. Some speculate that he could have been as young as 18 when Pat Garrett finally caught up to him. Contrary to Pat Garrett's claims, Billy never showed signs of having a nasty temper. According to the men who knew Billy, he was an easygoing young man who was always cool under pressure and usually maintained a very positive attitude. Although he killed Billy, the job he was hired to do, he lost re-election for sheriff of Lincoln County. Garrett would go on to be involved in shady business schemes, failed elections, and disgraced political appointments before he himself was finally shot and killed in 1909. Pat, in his ironically titled book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, are both considered on each sides of the Brushy Bill argument as flawed and highly embellished. Is this evidence that Brushy was really the kid? In my opinion, no, it's not. But there's a lot more to Brushy than just Pat Garrett's credibility. So let's dig deeper into the other evidence previously touched on in this episode, that Brushy Bill was who he said he was. Like I said, Brushy was said to be extremely knowledgeable of obscure facts involving the Lincoln County War, facts that would not have been widely known to the public in 1950. He knew names, could accurately describe buildings, including the layout of the Maxwell's place where Billy was killed. How could he have known this if he wasn't at least present during some of the events of the Lincoln County War? Secondly, Brushy was said to speak Spanish. He hobbled that shit, a language in which Billy was fluent. Then there's the physical characteristics. Brushy, like the kid, had small hands. They were said to have had the same color eyes. He also had bullet wound scars in places that Billy himself was said to have been shot. And why didn't they take any pictures of Billy's dead body? That was actually a pretty common occurrence in the Old West. Anytime an outlaw of prominence was killed, they'd lay him out, take pictures, sometimes even turning the pictures into postcards. Jesse James' body, if I'm not mistaken, was put out on display for a couple of weeks following his death. I actually have a pretty cool book called Gunfighters put out years ago by Time Life Books. They did a whole series on the Old West, lots of cool pictures, including plenty of dead outlaws. Some of them are in coffins, some of them are hanging from nooses still, and some are propped up against the wall like Morgan Freeman in Unforgiven. Why were there no pictures taken of Billy the Kid? Why was he buried the next day and his body not put up for display, or otherwise preserved? I mean, even nowadays, a lot of people doubt that bin Laden was even killed, just due to the fact that there's no visual evidence, he was buried at sea, and a picture has not been released to the public. It's quite possible that if they had taken a picture of a dead Billy the Kid, this whole issue would have been put to rest years ago. Also, as previously stated, there were 4 people who knew Billy the Kid that came forward and signed affidavits testifying that Brushy Bill was the kid. What about forensics? There was actually a photo comparison analysis done on pictures of Billy and Brushy conducted by the University of Texas. The study, supervised by Dr. Alan Bovick, was conducted at the Laboratory for Vision Studies and the Advanced Graphic Laboratory at UT at Austin. They compared pictures of Brushy Bill, both old and young, to the famous tintype of Billy, as well as another picture that's purported to be a young Billy. The results found that Brushy and Billy's facial structures were extremely similar. So much so that the results were presented to Andre McNeil, a chancery judge of Arkansas's 12th Judicial District, and attorney Helen Rice Grinder. McNeil and Grinder, both experienced in handling and making determinations on evidence, stated that based solely on the study, the case for William Henry Roberts, aka Brushy Bill, and Billy the Kid being the same man were strong, substantial, and excellent. And finally, there's Deputy John W. Poe, who was with Garrett the night Billy was allegedly killed. Upon viewing the body, Deputy Poe supposedly told Garrett that it was not Billy laying there and that he had killed the wrong man. Brushy Bill would later claim that the man killed in his place that night was named Billy Barlow. The director of the Billy the Kid Museum in Hyco, Texas, Sue Land, was quoted as saying that the best piece of evidence that Billy the Kid escaped Fort Sumner unscathed is Deputy Poe. Talking to a writer for Wide Open Country, Land said that when the Deputy United States Marshal that was with Pat Garrett at the time rolled over the body, he looked up and told Pat Garrett, "You've killed the wrong man." Evidently, this is recorded in the marshal's office in New Mexico. She goes on to say that since Garrett shot in the dark, it's likely that he mistakenly shot another man that night. The man Garrett killed reportedly had a full beard, while Billy only sported peach fuzz. Unwilling to admit his mistake, Garrett identified the young man as Billy the Kid and buried him. Sue said he was going to bury Billy the Kid, and that's what he did. Okay, so there you have it. That's some pretty strong evidence. Why the fuck won't these stupid historians just agree that Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid and then we can all order some pizza and have a Young Guns marathon? Well, okay, maybe not so fast. We've discussed the evidence in Brushy's favor. Now let's look at the evidence that he may possibly have been full of shit. One thing that stands out to me is that many of these claims come straight from the paralegal William Morrison himself. He's the one that claims that he heard Brushy speak Spanish. Brushy. Not Bushy. He heard Brushy speak Spanish. Yeah, it's so hard. I keep wanting to say Bushy. Brushy sounds like an old grizzled, like an old miner somewhere with a long beard. But Bushy sounds like a late 1970s porn star that was extremely hairy. Anyway, Morrison is the only one that claims that he heard Brushy speak Spanish. He's also the one that claims that he saw the bullet scars. He's the one that claimed all the physical similarities. Full disclosure, I have not read Morrison's book, Alias Billy the Kid, where I'm assuming most of these claims come from. So if I'm getting any of this shit wrong, please don't hesitate to correct me. You can contact me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. As far as Deputy Coe stating that Pat Garrett killed the wrong man, Coe himself, years later, would go on to write that they did indeed kill Billy that night at Fort Sumner. Not only that, but so did everybody else that was there. There were other witnesses there that night. The women of Fort Sumner, who knew and loved Billy, actually prepared his body for burial. And why would Garrett bury the wrong man and just give up on apprehending the kid altogether? What was his motive? He had already previously killed somebody who he thought was Billy. Was he fearing punishment for again killing the wrong man? Highly unlikely, because we know for sure that the situation did not go down as Garrett claimed. More than likely, the differing stories of Billy's last moments can be chalked up to Garrett trying to make himself look good and just trying to control the narrative. And why would he be so certain that Billy, presumed dead, would just disappear quietly into history and keep the secret? Why wouldn't it be just like every other time that Billy had eluded capture? Contrary to what the movies will tell you, the two men were not friends. Even according to Brushy Bill, Garrett shot him several times that night as he fled Maxwell's house. One of the bullets struck his jaw, by the way, a scar that I can't see in any of the numerous pictures of Brushy Bill. Why would you assume that the most notorious outlaw in the territory would just quietly ride away into the sunset and change his ways? Especially a wild-ass 21-year-old. If you believe that Pat Garrett faked the killing of Billy the Kid and that the kid actually kept it a secret for the next 70 years, I want you to do me a favor. Find a real-life 21-year-old. Tell them your deepest, darkest, juiciest secret. And see how long they keep their lips sealed. I'm guessing they'll post that shit on Instagram within the hour. And what about the signed affidavits? Honestly, I'm not going to waste much time discussing them. They're highly flawed. Some even signed by people who weren't even born yet when Billy the Kid was killed in 1881. How can they know Brushy and Billy were the same person when they weren't around when the historically agreed upon Billy was? One of the affidavits was signed by somebody who was a child at the time that he had a brief encounter with Billy. But then, 70 years later, he claimed that they were, in fact, the same person. This man, I believe his name was Severo Gallegos, even admitted that he didn't think Brushy looked old enough to be Billy. As far as the photo comparison test goes, there have been more than one, and they all differ. Nobody can agree on shit. I did find a post online that stated that Dr. Bovic from UT later claimed that the two pictures were not conclusively the same. He said that the face recognition tools were quite crude in 1990 and that they came to no positive conclusion. He also said that the original report misstated his conclusions. So make of that what you will. I'm not a reporter, an investigator, or an expert of any kind. I'm just some dumbass that thought it'd be fun to start a podcast and talk about shit that I find interesting. I don't have time to contact all these people or even figure out how to contact them. When it comes to photo comparisons, all I have is my own two eyes. And when it comes to my own two eyes, well, there's one verified picture of Billy the Kid, the famous 10 type, where he's got the pistol on his belt and he's holding a rifle. Anybody that's got a past interest in Billy or the Wild West has seen it. If you haven't, go ahead and Google it. And honestly, the kid looks horrible. He looks like, to put it nicely, like somebody with a severe learning disability. Kind of like how I sound when I talk. I actually find it interesting how bad Billy looks, seeing as how there were so many accounts stating that he was quite the ladies' man, especially amongst the local Hispanic women. Now me, I'm not much of a ladies' man, but one thing that me and Billy do have in common is a love for the Latinas. I can even speak a little bit of that Spanish. Yo habla español solo a las chicas bonitas? Yeah. Donde estás el baño, baby? Speak that shit, boy. Little bit goes a long way. There are many pictures of Brushy Bill, both young and old. And as far as I'm concerned, they look nothing like the picture of Billy the Kid. But who knows? I mean, I could show you a picture of me at the age of 18, all young and pretty, and you wouldn't believe your eyes as you gaze upon the bloated, prematurely aged creature that I am today. If Brushy really was 90 at the time of his death, he aged very well. However, if he was really born in 1879, he would have only been 71 at the time of his death. And the pictures I've seen look much more like a 71-year-old than that of a 90-year-old that lived a stressful, violent life. There's a picture of Brushy Bill laying dead in his casket, and even in death, he looks younger than 90. So everything I just went over is debatable. We can talk about the technological accuracy of the photo analysis test. We can discuss the validity of the affidavits. We can debate the merits of the testimony of Deputy Coe and Pat Garrett. Both sides have valid arguments. But here's what's not debatable, and as far as I'm concerned, the most damning piece of evidence against Brushy Bill Roberts: his credibility. I talked shit about Pat Garrett earlier, and now it's time to talk shit about Brushy. And this is the point where we're going to really wade into the whole confusion territory when it comes to different names and aliases that Brushy Bill claimed over the years. His real name, he claimed, was William Henry Roberts, born in 1859 in Buffalo Gap, Texas. He picked up the Brushy nickname when he was working as a scout in South Dakota, but he was officially living under the name Ollie L. Roberts. Remember what I said about confusion? Much like Billy the Kid, Brushy had many assumed aliases and nicknames. Roberts, or Ollie, or whatever the fuck his name was, shared his life story with Morrison. Catherine Bonney was not his mother, as conventional historians are pretty much in agreement about. She was actually his aunt. Orphaned at a young age, Roberts was taken in by Catherine, and she raised him as if he were her own. The problem here is that Brushy Bill's niece was in possession of the family Bible. And if you've never seen a family Bible, go to your grandma's house and ask for it. They're amazing. My grandma had one. Traditionally, all significant dates are recorded in the family Bible. Births, deaths, marriages, all that good stuff recorded as the events unfold. And hers specifically lists old Ollie Roberts as being born August 26, 1879. That would have made him 2 years old at the time of Billy the Kid's death. Brushy's niece, Geneva Pittman, once even stated, "I know for a fact my uncle was born in 1879. Another discrepancy in her family Bible, Brushy isn't Oliver L. Roberts, he's Oliver P. Roberts, the P standing for pleasant. And not only that, Brushy Roberts, aka Oliver P. Roberts, is found in several census records. I was actually able to find him on every census record from 1880 all the way up to 1940. We'll get to census records shortly. The main takeaway now is that he claimed in his old age that his middle initial was L. His family and all records from life state clearly that his middle initial was P. Sounds insignificant right now, but hopefully it'll all make sense later. But how can this be? Didn't Brushy Bill have his own family Bible that he cited his birth year as being 1859? We'll get to that in a moment. But first, a word from our sponsors. This episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast is brought to you by absolutely nobody. Have you heard my podcast? Who the fuck would sponsor this trash? Now, back to Brushy Bill. Before we get into his family Bible and the census records, let's talk about his life post-fake death. And boy, does he have quite a story to tell. And this is what I meant earlier when I said his credibility is the most damning piece of evidence against him. Brushy said that after escaping Fort Sumner in 1881, he fled to Mexico and found refuge with the Yaqui Indian tribe for a couple years. Okay, that's not completely unbelievable. If I was a wanted man, I'd probably want to go off the grid too. He soon returned to civilization, to Texas, where he got a job driving a salt wagon. Fair enough. I mean, a man's got to eat. And if you're a wanted man trying to start over, why not take a humble, quiet job? Stay out of the limelight, keep your head down, and start rebuilding your life. But the quiet life just didn't suit Billy the Kid. He soon came up with a new nickname for himself, the Texas Kid, and got work as a cowboy. How original is the nickname the Texas Kid, by the way? Also, you can't just give yourself a nickname, bro. You gotta earn that shit. I learned this the hard way. I've given myself several nicknames over the years, and none of them stuck. Genius Josh was the first one I gave myself. Nobody fucking believed that shit. Followed that up with I Think I Can Fight Josh. Got my ass kicked a few times by people with actual real fighting abilities. Then I went with my favorite, Huge Penis Having Josh. And literally everybody I knew refused to call me that, even to this day. Anyway, the Texas kid traveled up to the Black Hills of South Dakota, where he acquired the nickname that we know him by now, Brushy. Brushy Bill spent a few years in the area working as a scout and a guard for the stage line before spending some time in Idaho. In 1887, Brushy drifted on down to Nebraska and found work at Buffalo Bill Cody's ranch, where he utilized his superb horse-breaking skills. A year later, Brushy took on another alias, this time calling himself the Hugo Kid, and joined the Pinkerton Detective Agency, because that's what one does when on the run. You join the world's foremost investigative unit. A year later, again, evidently Brushy didn't like to stay in one place too long. He joined the Anti-Horse Thief Association. As a member of this association, Brushy operated in the Red River Valley of Texas and Indian Territory to help rid the region of horse thieves. I had previously never heard of the Anti-Horse Thief Association, and I assumed it was some made-up bullshit. Mostly because of the name. Anti-Horse Thief. Why not call it the Anti-Horse Theft Association? That just rolls off the tongue much better. But I checked, and it was actually a real group. Not an official arm of law enforcement, the Anti-Horse Thief Association was a vigilante-type group made up of private citizens who did just what the name suggests, regulated horse theft. Then, later on, the group just became sort of a fraternal and social organization. When Brushy was done solving the world's horse theft problems, he went to work as a deputy for Hanging Judge Parker. Remember him from the Bass Reeves episode? And just like Bass Reeves, he braved the dangers of Indian Territory and brought bandits to justice. Once he got tired of being such a badass, he decided to try something different. In 1889, he traveled to the annual Cowboy Roundup in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where he competed in a bronco riding contest and won a large cash prize. Now that he had some money jingling around in his pockets, you'd think that Brushy would settle down. Fuck no. Not if he wanted to go down in a blaze of glory. Nope. In 1890, after a life of an expert bronco buster began to bore him, he traveled to Cincinnati, Ohio, and became a professional boxer. Yep, not making any of this up. I know I joke around a lot, but I always admit when I'm bullshitting. This is actually what Brushy Bill Roberts, aka the man who claimed to have been Billy the Kid, said. This is his story, not mine. So just a quick recap. In the span of 9 years, he's lived with wild Indians, became an expert bronco buster, a deputy U.S. Marshal, a rodeo hand, a hunter of horse thieves, a cowboy, a Pinkerton detective, a stagecoach guard, and a professional boxer, all whilst living under super cool yet inauspicious names such as the Hugo Kid and the Texas Kid. Sound unbelievable? Yeah, it sure as hell does. Very unbelievable, actually. But we're not done yet. After getting bored with boxing, Brushy went back to the stupidly named Anti-Horse Thief Association and in 1892 became a U.S. Deputy Marshal, again, this time investigating train robberies. It was in this position that Brushy had a violent encounter with the murderous Dalton gang. They killed his partner, but when they recognized him as Billy the Kid, they let him go. Respect. Real recognize real. Continuing on with this totally true and absolutely not bullshit story, Brushy quit the Marshal Service and went back to breaking horses for a living. He also started touring the rodeo circuit. He was so good at that damn thing called the rodeo that he got a job in Argentina in 1893, teaching people how to handle horses. Being the expert that he was then hired to travel to the Shetland Islands off the coast of Scotland to catch more wild horses. Okay, after 3 months, he and the crew caught about 50 horses before sailing back and going to work once again for the dumb horse thief group, whatever the fuck they were called. And now is where things get interesting. While out searching for horse thieves, Brushy and his partner chanced upon 2 dead men. One of them he recognized as his cousin, Ollie L. Roberts, who Brushy claimed had run away from his Texas home years earlier. Before burying the men, he collected Ollie's personal effects to return to his family. Upon arriving in Texas, Brushy was mistaken by Ollie's own mother as actually being Ollie himself, because that's how moms operate. I'm sure if I went missing and a man almost 2 decades older than myself showed up at my parents' house, my mom would totally be convinced it was me. And Brushy just kind of went with it, which is not weird at all. After all, he did need a new alias. From that time on, he used this Ollie Roberts alias more than any other. And this is the alias he was living under at the time that he met with the paralegal Morrison. More on that to come. In 1894, he rejoined the U.S. Marshal Service and served for 3 more years fighting crime. He did also take time off now and then to perform in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Good Lord. If you're not familiar with the Wild West show, it was sort of a traveling circus, only instead of tigers and clowns and elephants, it featured Native Americans, former gunfighters, and lawmen. And they sort of recreated famous Wild West battles and put on shooting exhibitions. Being a part of the Wild West show in those days is the equivalent of starring in a TV show nowadays. Tiring of the limelight, old Brushy moved back down to Mexico in 1895 and established a ranch. Did he then settle down and finally live a life of peace? Of course not. He's Billy the motherfucking Kid. In 1898, calling himself the Hugo Kid once again, he joined up with the Rough Riders. The Spanish-American War was kicking off, and Brushy didn't want to miss out on the action. The Rough Riders was the name given to the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. Basically, this unit was full of men from the Indian Territory, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, pioneering frontiersman types. Native Americans rounded out the ranks, and so did Billy the Kid, apparently. Upon arriving in Cuba, he was made a scout, and then, based on his reputation as an expert bronco buster, was put in charge of handling the stock. Long story short, a few motherfuckers ended up dead, and he was discharged. He went back to Mexico, but in June of 1899, the president of Mexico ordered his ranch seized, including all horses and livestock. When the Mexican army came to confiscate the ranch, Billy fought back, killing about a dozen soldiers. Reinforcements were sent for, and within a few days, the ranch was surrounded by 1,000 Mexican soldiers. Billy and his companions fought their way through, because that's totally believable and something that could actually happen in real life, and safely arrived back on U.S. soil after 13 days of hard riding, the military dogging their trail the entire time. Once safely back in the motherland, Billy organized a Wild West show of his own, traveling and performing all over the United States. Whew, we're almost done. Just bear with me. By 1904, Brushy was back in the livestock business, buying, selling, and trading cattle throughout Texas and Oklahoma. But I guess being chased out of Mexico by the GD Army wasn't enough to keep Brushy away. By 1907, he was back and operating a new ranch, conveniently just in time for the Mexican Revolution to kick off. True to form and not willing to sit out a fight, Brushy joined up and served with Pancho Villa. Yeah, sure he did. As the Mexican Revolution was winding down, he returned to Texas in 1914. He got married, traveled around a little bit, took various jobs, such as an oil field worker and police officer, always using an alias, mind you. Now an old man, married to wife number 3, and no longer able to make a living with fictitious careers, Brushy and wife Melinda settled in Hamilton County, Texas, and this is where the paralegal and probable bullshit artist William Morrison found Brushy. After hearing that tall tale, how the hell can you lend any credibility at all to Brushy Bill Roberts? Obviously, none of that shit actually happened. His post-1881 claims read like something straight out of Michael Scarn's Threat Level Midnight. Only thing that was missing was Catherine Zeta-Jones. Imagine if I had been on the FBI's most wanted list in my early 20s, faked my death, and re-emerged at the age of 90, wanting a pardon. Where you been, Josh? What'd you do while you were on the run? Well, I lived in the Amazon jungle with an uncontacted tribe for a little bit. Then I used a fake name, joined SEAL Team 6, killed Bin Laden, wandered about a few years, joined the UFC, knocked out Conor McGregor. Oh, wow, that's really fascinating. Then what? Well, I decided to pursue a career in acting. I wrote, directed, and starred in the Game of Thrones. Not the series finale, though. That shit was horrible. After giving up a career of acting, I happened upon a children's hospital that was on fire. I rushed in and was able to save all of the children before the building collapsed. Not a big deal, but then I noticed that there was a puppy store directly adjacent to the children's hospital. Catching my breath, I did what anybody else would do. I stormed into the puppy store, single-handedly saving each and every puppy from what would have otherwise been a torturous death. I couldn't linger, though. The president needed me to become his chief of security and get the damn Secret Service in line. Get the fuck out of here. You wouldn't believe me if I told you that shit. I don't believe Brushy Bill. And William Morrison. He was either extremely gullible or a crook. He was either too stupid to see past Brushy's lies, or he was complicit in sharing them because he thought he could monopolize on the BS. Okay, that might have sounded harsh. If you are a Brushy Bill believer, a Bill-ever, if you will, I'm not calling you stupid or a liar. Everybody on both sides of this debate have their reasons, and most people are just curious. Regardless of who you believe, we're all just having fun reading and talking about the topic. When I mentioned bullshit and or stupidity, I was referring to Morrison and Brushy. Morrison either fed these lies to Brushy and took advantage of an old man, or they conspired together to make a quick buck. And that's not the only damning part of Brushy's credibility. He was also a strong supporter of J. Frank Dalton. Dalton, like Brushy, was a fake. He claimed to be Jesse James, but old J. Frank was a two-time faker. Before the Jesse James thing, he claimed to be a famous lawman, James Frank Dalton, who was killed in 1887. Once that shit ran dry, he changed his story to actually being Jesse James himself. And Brushy Bill was one of the bullshit artists who came forward to positively identify J. Frank as Jesse James. How do we know that J. Frank was full of shit? Well, the same way that I know I'm more of a Neanderthal than most people, thanks to 23andMe, DNA. Jesse James' body was actually exhumed and a DNA test was done and compared to one of his living descendants, and guess what? It was a match. Unfortunately, we can't do the same thing when it comes to Billy the Kid. Billy's grave, the official one at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, was washed away by a flood not long after Billy's death, and the location of the current grave is just a guess. Nobody knows exactly where his body is buried. There was for sure some shady shit that went down at Maxwell's place the night that Garrett killed the kid. But then again, witness testimonies differ pretty often. And when it comes to Brushy Bill Roberts, I'm going to have to agree with the historians. Billy died in 1881 and did not live to be an old man. Earlier, I mentioned a family Bible in Brushy's possession that said that he was born in 1859, which would make him old enough to be Billy the Kid. It also listed his name as William Henry Robert, the purported true name of Brushy Bill. I gotta call bullshit on this as well. The man traveled all over the U.S. to Argentina, Scotland, Cuba, fought in 2 wars, was chased out of Mexico by the military, and he somehow managed to keep his family Bible safe in his saddlebags? I suppose he could have kept it with a trusted friend while he traveled, but I still don't buy it. This Bible, in my opinion, if it even existed, was either given the fake birthday by Brushy Bill himself or William Morrison. And where's the Bible now? Does anybody have it? Has anybody seen it? A lot of other evidence in this case can be debated, but not Brushy Bill's credibility. And his credibility and that of Morrison is what much of this evidence is based off of. If you visit Brushy Bill's gravesite today, the headstone reads William Henry Roberts, aka Billy the Kid, born 31st December 1859, died 27th December 1950. And then there's a secondary stone surrounding it that reads at the top, Billy the Kid. This is not the original grave marker. The original slab reads Ollie L. Roberts, Brushy Bill, born December 3rd, 1868, died December 27th, 1950. 1868. This differs from the census records that claim for his entire life that he was born in 1879. But even if he was born in 1868, he would have only been 13 at the time of Billy the Kid's death in 1881. And was his fucking name Ollie L or Ollie P? This fucking guy and his names and the stupid dates. If you're not confused already, you're about to be. I honestly don't know where the L comes from. Brushy said that while working for the Anti-Horse Thief Association in 1894, he found his cousin, Ollie L. Roberts' body. He returned the remains to the family in Sulphur Springs, Texas. As far as I can tell, there was never an Ollie L. or an Oliver L. Roberts. According to census records, an Ollie P. Roberts was living in Sulphur Springs in 1900, 6 years after Brushy found his cousin Ollie. Well, technically, the census says that he was living in Hopkins County, which is where Sulphur Springs is. On the 1900 census, Ollie P. is listed as being a 20-year-old farmer. 1899 is when Brushy's Mexican ranch was seized by authorities. In 1902, he started his own Wild West show. So did he just happen to take a sabbatical between Mexico and touring the U.S. to take up farming with his dead cousin's family back in 1900? And his age is listed as 20, which lines up with all the other census records, assuming Ollie L. was really Ollie P. In 1900, Billy the Kid would have been 43 years old. We can debate all day long as to whether or not Brushy looked 90 at the time of his death in 1950, but it's real hard to confuse a 43-year-old with a 20-year-old. The dates and records just do not add up, in my opinion. Oliver P. Roberts shows up in every census from 1880, when he was a baby, all the way up to his death. He had to sign up for the draft during World War I, and that lists his name as Oliver P. Roberts. It also lists his birth date as August 26, 1878. However, his death certificate lists his name as Oliver L. Roberts, not P. Oliver L. and Oliver P. Which one was Brushy? This to me is the most confusing thing about this whole issue. I couldn't find any answers. Finally, I turned to Ancestry.com. If you've ever researched your family tree, you know how invaluable census records are, especially from about 1850 to 1940. They not only list the names of everyone in the household, but their year and place of birth, their occupation, and even sometimes whether or not they could read or write, their birthplaces of their parents, etc. Someone's life who lived in the United States in Brushy Bill's era would have been highly documented just with census records alone. So here's what I found. there was an Oliver P. Roberts. He first shows up on a census in 1880, listed as 1 year of age. He's on the 1900 census, which I previously mentioned, as a farmer. Again, in 1910, when Brushy was supposedly in Mexico fighting with Pancho Villa, Oliver P. was living a simple farmer's life in Van Zandt County, Texas. And Van Zandt's very close to Hopkins County, Texas, where Oliver P. was living in 1900 with his parents. In 1910 and 1920, he's still on the census records as a farmer laborer in Van Zandt County. Once again, in 1930, he's still living in Van Zandt County. I found this particular census really interesting because one of the categories asked if you own a radio or not. And he did not. I guess he's about as much of a fan of stupid radio morning DJ voices as I am. What if I did the rest of this podcast in a stupid morning radio DJ voice? Welcome to the Morning Zoo Funny Farm. Get ready for a hot, balmy day today. Highs in the upper 90s. And speaking of hot, why do bananas need sunscreen? Because they peel. Oh. My wife once told me I had to stop impersonating a flamingo. I had to put my foot down. I want to sincerely apologize for that last segment. That was bad even by my standards. So let's just go ahead and forget it ever happened and go back to old Brushy. In 1930, his occupation is listed as a cotton farmer, and very interestingly enough, it states that he was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. But was he really? A search of rosters found no Oliver L. or Oliver P. Roberts as having served in the war. Also, no records of William Henry Roberts as having served. I suppose you could make the assumption that because he's Billy the Kid and still wanting to remain anonymous, that he'd enlist under an alias. It's exhausting, isn't it? In 1940, Brushy and his wife Letitia are found on the census living in Gregg County, Texas, very near to all of his other residences previously mentioned. Gregg County, Van Zandt County, and Hopkins County are all located in northeast Texas. I mean, on record, other than claiming to have served in the Spanish-American War, it looks like up until at least the age of 70, this man spent his entire life in East Texas. Brushy's wife, Letitia, died in 1944. A year later, he married again to a lady named Melinda Merle in Hamilton County, Texas. Now, this is the first record of Oliver Roberts living outside of East Texas, other than being born in Arkansas. Hamilton County, Texas is where Hico is located, the town in which he died. To give you a frame of reference, Hico is located southwest of Dallas and kind of northwest of Waco. 5 years after marrying Melinda, Brushy himself would pass away. At what point did Oliver P. start referring to himself as Oliver L? It looks like around the same time that he moved to the Hico area. His marriage license states that his middle initial is L, not P, and so does his death certificate and his original 1950 grave marker. I think also around the time of the move is when he started doing the whole Billy the Kid thing. And it's also when he met with noted liar J. Frank Dalton, the man that claimed to be Jesse James. So I just wonder if it wasn't just him distancing himself from his East Texas life. While looking into the whole issue of Ollie L versus Ollie P, I came across a true gem of the internet, a Brushy Bill message board. If you want to check it out, it can be found at brushybill.proboards.com. So this message board is definitely pro Brushy Bill being Billy the Kid, mostly. There's a couple of guys that pop up every now and then denying that Brushy was who he said he was. And you can tell everybody else is just like, what the fuck, dude? This fucking guy again? But they are very civil. I get the feeling they're probably an older demographic. Nobody's cussing anyone out or being out and out rude or anything like that. So anyway, I made a post on there asking for some clarification between the L or the P for the middle initial. And I also reached out to the site moderator, a man named Wayne Land. He replied both to my post and the direct message that I sent him. I also reached out to him asking if I could share this information on my podcast. I said that if he would prefer, I wouldn't even use his name. He replied back that I could use this info any way I wanted, as long as it's presented as just a plausible theory and not based on any hard evidence. So keep that in mind. He is not saying any of what follows is absolutely true. He believes that Brushy was Billy the Kid, and as such, believes that he himself should at very least be able to have a plausible theory about Oliver L, which he shared with me and we will get to in a moment. This was my original post. I said, in the book Billy the Kid, Beyond the Grave, it states that while working with the Anti-Horse Thief Association, Brushy found the dead body of his cousin, Oliver L. Roberts, and returned it home to his family in Sulphur Springs, Texas. He then took on his cousin's name as an alias, one that he was using when Mr. Morrison met with him in the late 1940s. Brushy's original grave marker states that his name was Oliver L. Roberts. When I looked into the census records, they all pop up as Oliver P. Roberts. The family of Oliver P. was living in Sulphur Springs in 1900, so it's probable they were also there in 1894 when Brushy reported finding his dead cousin's body. Was the cousin in fact Oliver P.? If so, why did Brushy go by Oliver L.? Was he just misinformed on his cousin's middle initial? I then followed that up with, is there evidence that William Henry Roberts was related to the Ollie Roberts family? Since this episode's already almost an hour long, I'm going to go ahead and read his reply in full, as he seems to be very well read on the subject, and he's willing to engage in conversation with somebody that may not necessarily agree with him. As silly as I consider Brushy Bill's comments to be at this point, I'm still curious to know why people are such ardent defenders of his. So here's what Mr. Land said. Your question is a very important one that has been debated vigorously on this board for quite some time. I believe Brushy used the middle initial L because there really was a cousin, Oliver L., who had died. I believe it was a coincidence that Oliver P., who had just divorced his first wife, disappeared around the same time. This would have been around 1910, give or take a year or so. We know Brushy himself was married 3 times after 1910. On all those documents, he used the name Oliver L. or just Oliver. There is one document only where we know Brushy used the middle initial P. That was on the draft registration he did in 1918. I believe the reason for the switch to P on that document was because it was Oliver P. who was being required to register and not Oliver L. Side note, this is me talking now. I think the reason he mentioned being required was there was actually age requirements for the draft. So I think that's in reference to that. He went on to say, others used the draft registration to attempt to prove Brushy's real identity was Oliver P. Roberts, but I don't accept that. Or they use the fact that no Oliver L. Roberts shows up on any census records or birth records, etc., to try to prove that there really was no cousin, Oliver L. Roberts. I don't accept that either, because I know it's possible that such a person might not have even participated in any official records. I know this is all confusing and overly complex, but I will add one more comment that might surprise a lot of board members. I have lately become convinced that if it truly was Oliver P. Roberts that Brushy was pretending to be, then his true identity likely was Oliver P. Roberts and not William H. Roberts. But since there is so much other compelling evidence that he really was Billy, just as he claimed to be, I can't accept that the alias Oliver Roberts came from Oliver P. Roberts. I believe the alias was taken from a real cousin, Oliver L. Roberts, just as Brushy claimed. A cousin, Oliver L., who was either illegitimate or an abandoned child, taken in by the Roberts family, and for some reason hidden from census and other documentation. That Roberts family could have been Brushy's uncle, his aunt, his first or second cousin, etc. We'll likely never know, but if we do eventually find an Oliver L. Roberts born around the right time and a cousin, however far removed, to a William H. Roberts or to Oliver P. Roberts, then we'd have a smoking gun of major significance. All right, that was his response in full. He also responded to the private message that I sent him, expounding on this theory. He states that even he believes there's no way Oliver P. could have been Billy the Kid, which any objective person should be able to admit. I mean, the paper trail is just too thorough on Oliver P. He then went on to talk about how Brushy discovered his dead cousin, Oliver L. Roberts, and returned the remains back home to Texas, as I previously discussed. Like I said before, Brushy was 20, and this is me talking now, this is not Mr. Land. Brushy was 20 years older than Ollie P., whose census records we went over previously. We also know that according to Brushy, Ollie P.'s mother thought Brushy was Ollie P., and that he just kind of went with it, assuming his cousin's identity. Now, Mr. Land's theory, as I understand it, again, I hope I'm getting this right because I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. The mother of Ollie P. Roberts also had an older son that had gone missing years earlier named Oliver L. Roberts. One more time, I hope I'm understanding his argument correctly. Also keep in mind that Mr. Land is very clear that this was just speculation on his part and not based on any hard evidence, just a theory. So continuing, Mr. Land states correctly that Brushy Bill's death certificate as well as his original tombstone list his name as Oliver L. Roberts and that his date of birth was December 31st, 1868. He goes on to say that that's too late to be Billy the Kid's birthday and too early to be Oliver Pleasant Roberts' birthday. Brushy told Morrison that he was born on December 31st, 1859 as William H. Roberts. So where did this 1868 date come from? Obviously, that's what Brushy had told his last wife who provided the information for the death record. Could 1868 be the birth date of the real Oliver L. Roberts? It certainly seems so to me. He goes on to state that this mysterious Oliver L. could have been an illegitimate child born to a very young and unmarried Sarah Elizabeth, and that maybe she could have given the child up to a relative to raise, thus making it probable that she'd mistake Brushy for her long-lost son. Thank you for that reply, Mr. Land. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing you or misinterpreting what you said at all. If I am, and there's anything I just mentioned that you'd like to correct me on or clarify, please contact me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. I will absolutely post an update on my next podcast stating your position. Now, to his credit, Mr. Land does say that this is all very far-fetched, but feasible. And he's not trying to make it a secret that he believes that Brushy Bill was really Billy the Kid. I personally don't find it all that feasible, just due to the fact that it hinges on there being a mysterious cousin, Oliver, that just happened to have a different initial, and or a mother naming two of her children with the same first name. Even in the past, when I did research on my own family tree, I never saw a census listing two children as having the same first name. But once again, in Mr. Land's defense, this has actually happened. I'll give you a great modern day example. The powerful Olympic gold medalist, ordained minister, author, entrepreneur, and two-time heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Big George Foreman. This man named 5 of his sons George. So this is a family with not only 2 children sharing the first name, but 5. And not only that, if I'm not mistaken, they also all share the same middle name as well. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, and Mr. Land is right. Brushy Bill's wife at the time of his death was his next of kin, I think. He didn't have any children that I'm aware of. It's only logical to assume that it was she who provided the info for his death certificate and his tombstone, or maybe one of her children from a previous marriage. Having only been married for 5 years, they obviously got the birth date wrong. But Ollie L as opposed to Ollie P? It's clear to me at least that Brushy really was Oliver P. Roberts. There was no William Henry Roberts, as the tombstone claims. So why did he start going by Ollie L as opposed to Ollie P? Unless it was like I said earlier, and he was just trying to distance his new persona, Billy the Kid, to his highly traceable real name, Ollie P., the farmer from East Texas. And how much of this was done by him or by the urging of the paralegal Morrison. If you want to join in on the debate, give brushybill.proboards.com a visit. I'm sure I will check in there every now and then as well. So anyway, it looks like there's 2 options here, or 2 scenarios. Scenario 1, Billy the Kid was not killed in 1881. He fled to Mexico. In 1894, a 35-year-old Billy found the dead body of his 15-year-old cousin, or his cousin's older and unknown to history brother, who had the same name. He then took the identity of his cousin and used it as an alias for the rest of his life, contradicting the testimony of his niece and that of the Roberts family Bible. Or, scenario 2, Oliver P. Roberts was born in 1879. He spent most of his life in Texas as a farmer and a laborer. As a child, he grew up on tales of the Old West, which he barely missed out on. He likely met many real-life people who were involved in historical Wild West events. He possibly visited Buffalo Bill's Wild West show as a kid at some point. And his imagination went wild. He grew older and started telling tall tales. To me, at this point, scenario 2 is more likely. I mean, it happens even nowadays. People get busted all the time claiming to be phony Vietnam War vets, when they weren't even old enough to have served in Vietnam. I've personally known 2 such people. I spoke about confirmation bias earlier, and I think that's what's really going on this whole debate. Much like Bigfoot, people want to believe that Billy the Kid lived being an old man, and they'll ignore any evidence that suggests otherwise. Look no further than the History Channel to see proof of this in action. That Oak Island show has been going strong for 5 seasons, and there's not shit down in that hole. But people still watch it. And not only do they watch it, but it's one of the highest rated shows on the network. And I suppose that, in and of itself, is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when we're talking about something as trivial as Billy the Kid. There's a tiny, minuscule portion of the world's population who even knows what the hell we're talking about. It obviously has no impact on world events. And at the end of the day, we're just having fun. So Brushy Bill supporter or not, God bless you all. My only issue really is when this line of thinking invades all other aspects of your life. And I think confirmation bias is a major issue in society today. And in today's golden era of fake news, this is clearly not healthy. Everybody belongs to a tribe, and it's constantly us versus them. Democrats versus Republicans, meat eaters versus vegans, pro-life versus pro-choice. Instead of looking at both sides of the story and weighing all of the evidence equally, we pick and choose what we want to believe in and ignore the merits of the arguments that don't fit our narrative. Consider Occam's razor. Basically, it's the idea that the simplest answer is most often correct. This is something that applies to our lives on a weekly, if not daily basis. For instance, something I think we can all relate to. Let's say I'm running late for work and I can't find my car keys. Let's also say that I heard a weird sound a couple of days ago when I was home alone after watching a really creepy episode of Black Mirror. Thus, the only logical conclusion is that my house is haunted and a demon child hid my keys, right? Or is it that I simply accidentally placed my keys in the fridge when I got home from work because I was in such a hurry to grab a cold bottle of water and lay my fat ass down on the couch and relax? The amount of mental gymnastics I have to do to convince myself that Brushy Bill was actually Billy the Kid are massive. The simple answer, the most probable answer, the least fun answer, the answer that all historians agree upon, is that Billy the Kid was killed by Pat Garrett in 1881. And if you look at Brushy Bill's claims, it's not just a slight embellishment. Everybody embellishes, especially these old West guys, but not to the extent that he did. You couldn't even make his life into a movie. That's how unbelievable this shit is. So, while extremely fun to think about, and I did have fun researching this episode, I personally have come to the conclusion that Brushy Bill Roberts was just an old man telling lies. Alright, I hope I didn't offend anybody too much with this episode. I am going to post a link to the Brushy Bill message board, so if any of y'all are listening, I hope you didn't find me too disrespectful. I know there's a lot of details I failed to mention, but that's probably because I either didn't have enough time, or I just didn't think they were significant and didn't matter to the greater scale of things. Or I just don't know what the hell I'm talking about, which is always possible. I don't have a problem with anybody who still thinks that Brushy Bill was the kid. My only beef is with the bigger issue of confirmation bias and tribalism. I think we as a society would greatly benefit by teaching ourselves to be critical thinkers. Maybe then we could avoid shit like the measles breaking out in Portland because these crazy-ass anti-vaxxers are scared that their kids are going to become autistic. Maybe then we could stop arguing in 2019 about whether or not the earth is flat. Now, just for fun, let's talk about some of these other real-life people that were featured in Young Guns. Did you know that John Tunstall, the kindly old man that took Billy in under his wings, wasn't really an old man? Nope! In real life, John Tunstall was only 25 at the time of his death, not much older than Billy himself. Neither Josiah Doc Scurlock or Jose Chavez E. Chavez died like they did in the movies. Chavez would live to be 72. After Billy's death, he sort of drifted all over the Southwest. At one point, he became a sheriff's deputy, but soon went back to a life of crime. He received a death sentence in 1894, a sentence that was later reduced to life in prison. However, during a prison riot, Chavez actually helped the guards out, and on January 11th, 1909, the governor of New Mexico granted him something that Billy the Kid never received, a pardon. For the next 15 years, Chavez led a relatively quiet life and died of natural causes in his home in 1924. Doc Scurlock never married a Chinese lady, and he didn't die in a gunfight. Directly after the Lincoln County War, he moved to Texas, settled down, and became a highly respected citizen. He died at the age of 80 and is buried in Eastland, Texas. He was said to have never spoken much about his younger years. Speaking of Young Guns, how many damn movies have been made about Billy the Kid, and how inaccurate are they? The first film about his life came out as early as 1911. Billy the Kid was a silent film, which was the first of over 50 movies made so far about the outlaw's brief yet infamous life. Val Kilmer was 30 when he appeared in Billy the Kid. Paul Newman was 33 when he played Billy the Kid in The Left-Handed Gun. Chris Christopherson was 37 when he played Billy the Kid in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Chris Christopherson was 37 when he played Billy in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. The one who came closest was Emilio Estevez, who was 26 when he first starred in Young Guns. Basically, just like Friday Night Lights and every other high school drama, let's just hire a bunch of 30-year-olds to play teenagers. Okay, let's talk about updates on my previous episode on Al Swearingen. Spoiler alert, the Deadwood movie came out and it was fucking awesome. If you haven't seen it yet, skip this part. I loved it. Although totally historically inaccurate, I don't care. Great writing, great characters, great cast. It was amazing. My only qualm was that it just wasn't long enough. I would have loved to have seen another 30 minutes of footage, even some follow-up on Hearst being arrested. Actually, it turns out there is 30 more minutes of footage out there that didn't make the cut. Actor W. Earl Brown, who portrays Dan Doherty, revealed as much. The cut includes what he considered his best scene, having a heartfelt conversation with Trixie regarding Al's health. So hopefully one of these days that extra footage will be released in maybe an extended cut or as bonus features. And I think that's it for the updates. Please contact me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com to drop me some feedback. And if you so desire, feel free to give me a review and a rating on iTunes. So that wraps up this episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too confusing. I hope I didn't ruin Young Guns for you. I hope, as old age creeps in, you don't decide to make up fantasy stories about your glory years. Brushy Bill Roberts, like many of my recent ancestors, was an undoubtedly tough cotton farmer in East Texas, in a time before we had such luxuries as air conditioning, tractors, and cable TV to distract us from the hell of manual labor. He had no need to embellish, but he did, and his legacy is tarnished by doing so.